In 1890, the Chancellor of the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck, had predicted that the next major war in Europe would be caused by some damn foolish thing in the Balkans. A quarter of a century later, that was exactly what happened. On the 28th of June, 1914, assassins shot dead the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Crown Prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at the Serbian city of Sarajevo in the Balkans. Within a month, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Little Serbia, and all the big powers in Europe, tied to an unbreakable web of alliances, were forced to take sides and mobilize their armies. Within 5 weeks, the Sarajevo incident had mobilized itself into World War I. People called it the Great War because no war had ever been so enormous in size, in scope, in effort, and in losses. In just over 4 years, 70 million men served in uniform. 9 million of them would die, leaving 3 million widows and 10 million orphans. It was the first war to use massed machine guns, high explosive shells, poison gas, tanks, submarines, and airplanes. It was a war that eventually affected almost every country on Earth, and its horrors would be remembered for generations. Germany had the best trained army in the world at that time. They also had the best general staff, the men who plan and run wars. The German general staff had been planning how to run this particular war for the last 9 years, and they developed a cunning plan. Prepared by Count Alfred von Schlieffen in 1905, the Schlieffen Plan called for a quick knockout blow in the West. It was designed to capture Paris in 6 weeks, then quickly turn about to attack Russia. Paris for lunch and dinner in St. Petersburg, said the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Schlieffen Plan was a gamble, the first of 4 great gambles that milestoned the war for Germany. It began from the 1st to the 3rd of August, when German troops flooded into neutral Luxembourg without firing a shot. Then, on the 4th of August, Germany launched its army against Little Belgium. To everyone's surprise, particularly the Germans, Belgium's little army of 200,000 men resisted for over 2 weeks, giving Britain and France precious time to prepare. Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August. The declaration was immediately repeated throughout the British Commonwealth, all of whom belatedly started mobilizing their troops. They were late, and most were a long way from the fighting. But the 2 weeks gained by Belgium's resistance allowed a British expeditionary force of 150,000 men to get across the English Channel and take position on the left of the French. France responded to the German attack by launching its own Plan 17, a major offensive against Germany's frontier at Alsace and Lorraine. But French tactics were pathetically outdated for 20th century warfare. French soldiers still dressed in bright red and blue 19th century uniforms and were taught to advance neatly across the battlefield. As a result, in this first great French offensive, they advanced neatly to their death. Delighted German gunners had a field day cutting them to pieces with machine guns and artillery fire. Tens of thousands died before the offensive was halted. On one day alone, the 22nd of August, France lost 28,000 men. It was the bloodiest day in French military history. Plan 17's only achievement was to draw French armies away from the Belgian border. That helped the Germans, who now advanced on Paris at the alarming rate of 30 and 40 kilometers a day. In response to the rapid German advance, British and French forces simply retreated in good order. Unlike the Germans, their supply lines grew shorter with every kilometer. They were also about to experience a lucky break, one of those unexpected fortunes of war, which became known as the Miracle of the Marne. As the German attack approached the River Marne, it suddenly faltered. Although victorious everywhere, the German spearheads had begun to lose contact with each other, and gaps opened in their front. British and French forces in these gaps were able to attack the Germans from behind, and suddenly, in a crisis of confidence, the German General Staff ordered a brief halt in the attack to regroup and resupply. At that same moment, the French were able to scrape together a new army from reinforcements who arrived on foot, in trucks, by rail, and even in a fleet of specially hired Paris taxicabs. These reinforcements counterattacked between the 5th and 9th of September 1914 in the First Battle of the Marne. It permanently halted the momentum of the Schlieffen Plan. Try as they might, and they tried mightily, the Germans were never able to get it moving again. The first stage of the First World War had come to an end. Now mobility gave way to trench warfare. The halting of the German armies within shelling distance of Paris quickly transformed the Western Front into a race for the sea. Both sides spread sideways to outflank each other. Neither side succeeded, and before long, the battle lines stretched across southern Belgium and northern France, from Switzerland to the English Channel. The Germans, determined to hold what they'd so far won, now chose the best defensive positions on the highest ground and began to dig in. The British and French armies opposite them also began digging, but often on poor ground, lower, wetter, and under observation by the German guns. As a result, good trenches were essential, ideally 7 foot deep by 6 foot wide, and connected by smaller communications trenches to the units each side and the supplies in the rear. With sumps and duckboards and sandbags and wire out front in no man's land for protection, these trenches soon became the enduring image of the Western Front. Despite several enormous battles in the field of Flanders and legendary places like Ypres, neither side could smash through these new trench systems, though by the end of 1914 they'd lost 1 million men trying. And so, with no immediate prospect of a quick victory in the West, both sides began looking at other fronts and other allies as a means of breaking the deadlock. For the Central Powers, the options appeared rather limited. When war was declared, they'd quickly gained the support of Bulgaria and Turkey. Thereafter, no one joined them. By contrast, the Triple Entente gained extensive support throughout the war. First to side with them were their own colonial possessions and empire nations. Canada and Newfoundland were the first to land troops in support of Britain. They started reaching the Western Front before the end of 1914, and the bulk of Canada's 1st Division was in place by February 1915. Australian and New Zealand troops also answered the call, but found themselves diverted to Egypt and the war against Turkey. From April to December 1915, they took part in the attack at Gallipoli, an adventure which cost 8,000 Australian and nearly 3,000 New Zealand lives, but created the enduring Anzac legend. But while great battles were taking place on many other fronts, the British cabinet and most British generals firmly believed that the Western Front was the place where the war would be won or lost. So did the French, and so did the Germans. And so, inevitably, all eyes returned to the men in the trenches. Life in the trenches had by now taken on a grim reality of its own. New recruits, stuffed full of propaganda, believed the Western Front was the best place to get covered in glory. Covered in mud was more likely. Corporal Henry Gregory recalls what it was like fighting in the trenches in November 1917.
This was the winter when the trenches gave way and fell in. What a state they were in. They were filled 2 or 3 feet in water and mud. We were always soaked well above the knees and plastered in mud. We had to sleep and stand about all day in this condition. The discomforts at this time were terrible and can hardly be realised by those who weren't there.
Despite the wet conditions, pure drinking water was hard to come by. Men collected it from shell holes and hoped that dead bodies weren't floating just below the surface. Food was also hard to come by, especially when enemy shelling prevented resupply. Tasteless bully beef, moldy bread, and smelly cheese was sometimes supplemented by that great trench delicacy, dried rat. With water that had run off dead bodies, and rats that had fed off dead bodies, and the lice and fleas that came off the rats, little wonder that trench-bound soldiers were soon suffering agonies from dysentery and worse. Soldiers on both sides sometimes had to put up with these conditions for months at a time. Everyone agreed that living like this was no joke. But jokes were one of the few things that made trench life bearable. Humor, mateship, and good-natured resourcefulness often provided the only relief from a hell that quickly crushed your idealism if it didn't crush your life. Staying alive during these extended periods required luck as much as training, since danger was everywhere. The chief danger was fear. Fear of the dozens of forms of unexpected death that haunted soldiers every day. It drove men mad, an ever-present threat. Also ever-present were artillery bombardments. A big enemy shell could collapse a whole trench and bury its defenders. And it wasn't just enemy shells one had to fear. As many as 75,000 Allied troops were estimated killed by Allied shells that dropped short. Ever-present shelling also led to shell shock. Some senior officers, usually ones who spent little time near the trenches, treated shell-shocked men as cowards trying to get out of fighting. But the effects of shelling were real enough to Sergeant Archie Barwick.
In 5 minutes, 75 big shells landed near us. The ground rocked and swayed from the concussion. Men were driven stark, staring mad, and more than one of them rushed out of the trench over towards the Germans. Any amount of them could be seen crying and sobbing like children, their nerves completely gone.
Between 1914 and 1918, the British Army identified 80,000 men as sufferers of shell shock. But a much larger number with the symptoms were classified as malingerers and sent back to the trenches. There, they may also have faced poisonous gas. Outlawed by the Hague Convention as a criminal weapon, poison gas was nevertheless used by all sides. Heavier than air, it rolled along the ground like mist and could fill a trench or dugout before sleeping soldiers could raise the alarm. A Canadian nurse left this record of a young gas victim she treated.
He was sitting up in bed, fighting for breath, his lips plum-coloured. He was a magnificent young Canadian, past all hope in the asphyxia of chlorine. I shall never forget the look in his eyes as he turned to me and gasped, "I can't die. Is it possible that nothing can be done for me?"
Gas was a real terror weapon. Only about 7% of victims died from it, but all feared it. It was first used in a major attack in 1915, just as the war on the Western Front was entering its most terrible stage, the Great Slaughter. On an April evening in 1915, Canadian, Moroccan, and Algerian troops manning a line of trenches near Ypres noticed clouds of yellow-green smoke drifting towards them across the battlefield from the German lines. As it reached their trenches, the French colonial troops doubled up in agony, and many began to run for their lives. Those who stayed were suffocated or blinded. The smoke was chlorine gas. Two days later, attacking Germans used it against the Canadians as well. Strangely, the German troops had little faith in their new weapon, and their follow-up plans were poor. When the Canadians counterattacked, they managed to throw the Germans back, but not without terrible casualties. Canada lost 1/3 of her little national force at this second Battle of Ypres. The Allies now struck back with several major attacks on the Western Front, but the Germans had constructed their defenses in depth, and no attack managed to break through. The British and French kept trying, however, and lost another 1 million men in the process by the start of 1916. The war had now become a battle of attrition. The Germans realized they had less resources for this type of fighting, and they now took their second great gamble of the war. Their plan was to create a killing ground into which they could lure masses of French soldiers, who could then be slaughtered at little risk. With this tactic, reasoned the Germans, it might be possible to bleed the French army to death. The place they chose for their killing ground was the fortified city of Verdun in eastern France. They opened their attack with 1 million rounds of artillery dropped on the French defenses. Then German troops moved in, using phosgene gas, machine guns, and another new weapon, the flamethrower. The French quickly called in massive reinforcements. Defending Verdun became a matter of French national honor. The German gamble seemed to be paying off with massive French casualties. But then the Germans seemed to lose sight of their original purpose and sent their own soldiers into the killing ground to claim victory. The result was that soldiers on both sides became cannon fodder, causing a bloodbath that lasted 10 months and cost the lives of 1.2 million men. And as the slaughter yard of Verdun continued, an equally terrible battle was shaping up further west near the River Somme. It was planned by Sir Douglas Haig, one of Britain's most experienced generals. Using mainly British and Commonwealth troops, it aimed to relieve the pressure on Verdun by drawing away the German reserves and destroy them. Haig was another of those who believed that the war must be won or lost on the Western Front. He also believed in old-fashioned crash-through or crash tactics. Later generations condemned Haig for using the tactics of a butcher and for never visiting the front line to see the awful slaughter his plans produced. But Haig was just one of the many generals on all sides in this great war to whom plans had become more important than people. And so, on the 1st of July, 1916, Haig's great Battle of the Somme began with a massive artillery barrage lasting 5 days. The British thought nothing could survive that barrage, and one commander even ordered his men to advance in parade ground formation. Unfortunately, many shells landed in no man's land, churning it to mud and making the advance difficult and slow. In addition, the Germans had survived the barrage in deep underground concrete shelters. As the attackers struggled towards them, German machine gunners rushed from their shelters, set up their weapons, and poured out a murderous fire. German artillery and aircraft soon joined in the attack, which quickly became another slaughter. In fact, it became the worst slaughter ever suffered by the British Army in a single day. No one dared to give an order to stop them that bright July morning. Haig had forbidden any changes in his plan, so whole units were sent to their deaths. Almost the entire Newfoundland regiment was wiped out before lunchtime on the first day. Friendly artillery also dropped short and knocked down whole companies of soldiers. Others were sucked down and drowned in the mud. By evening, over 57,000 casualties littered the battlefield. Hundreds of thousands more were to die as the attack continued week after week. The Australians, newly arrived in France from the Middle East, were pushed into a diversionary attack and lost 5,500 men in one day. They would lose 4 times that number before the Somme battles ended. The New Zealanders attacked the village of Flers, where the tank made its first ever appearance in battle. But despite the use of this secret weapon, the Kiwis suffered 6,000 casualties, a huge loss for a little nation. The Canadians, barely recovered from the gas of Second Ypres, were moved into a supposedly quiet section for a surprise attack. They lost 2,500 men before the attack even started. Before it ended, they would lose 24,000. In total, before the November rains ended the Battle of the Somme, Britain and France lost 600,000 men. 236,000 Germans also died in what their historians actually named Der Blutbad, the bloodbath. One would think that by the end of 1916, there was indisputable evidence that the tactic of massive frontal assault had been discredited as tragically wasteful and ineffective. But no, many of the same generals were left in charge to plan more of the same wasteful and ineffective frontal assaults. The effects of such bloodbaths were disastrous on morale, particularly in the French army. Mutinies erupted, which paralyzed it for months. But Britain's General Haig was undeterred and already planned a repeat performance. This time, he intended to strike the area around Ypres again. This third Battle of Ypres is also called Passchendaele, after the town where it ceased 4 months later. Third Ypres was a monstrous exercise in futility. It began 1 year after the bloody Somme battles failed to teach Haig any lessons. As a result, Third Ypres lasted almost as long and followed the same terrible pattern. This time, the opening barrage lashed out for twice as long. 10 whole days of continuous shell fire. Haig thought it would shatter the Germans. But it only succeeded in shattering the French drainage system. Right on time, the winter rains began, and soon the shell-torn ground had become a muddy swamp, sucking men down and slowing them up to make perfect targets for German gunners. It was a repeat of the Somme slaughter on a grander scale. Australia suffered 38,000 casualties. New Zealand also lost thousands, and the Canadians, who finally capturing the town of Passchendaele in a blinding rainstorm, lost 4 men out of every 5 who attacked. The 3 great battles of Verdun, Somme, and Passchendaele have come to epitomize fighting on the Western Front. 2 million people died, and in the end, the Western Front remained locked in stalemate. On other fronts, however, the losses were having an effect on the course of the war. At sea, the British and German fleets fought an inconclusive battle at Jutland off Denmark in 1916. Though the British fleet lost more ships, it retained control of the North Sea. The Battle of Jutland led directly to a continued economic blockade of German ports, which led to shortages in the German economy. The winter of 1916-1917 was also a bad one. Germans called it the turnip winter, for that was all they had to eat. Turnips, therefore, led Germany to declare unrestricted U-boat warfare in early 1917. They hoped to sink all ships carrying supplies to Britain and force the UK to the conference table. This was Germany's third great gamble, for it entailed the risk of provoking war with America. The Germans took this risk and lost. In April 1917, the USA declared war against Germany. But while the U.S. was gathering its forces for war, an event occurred which gave the Germans a last glimmer of hope. Revolution broke out against the Russian Tsar. By November 1917, whilst tanks were fighting their first mass battles on the Western Front, Lenin and his Bolsheviks took control of Russia and immediately ended the war with Germany by capitulating. In effect, this released all German forces in the east for reassignment to the Western Front. On the 21st of March 1918, Germany used them in its fourth and final gamble. The March offensive was a series of 5 great surprise attacks on different parts of the Allied lines, with no advanced artillery barrage as warning. It aimed to inflict a desperate final knockout blow in the West and win the war before the United States of America could bring its full strength against Germany. The initial attack fell on British troops in the Somme area. Its violence caused the British Fifth Army to collapse, leaving a 65-kilometer gap in the Allied line. The Germans used picked storm troops to race through the gap. General Haig had only the Anzacs in reserve. But they were enough, and in several hard-fought battles through March and April, the Anzacs played a major role in halting the main German advance before the town of Amiens. German General Ludendorff then launched fresh attacks at other places, made new breakthroughs, and reached the River Marne, 60 kilometers from Paris. But victory eluded him. American troops now joined the Canadians, British and French in crushing his attacks and turning them all back. On the 8th of August 1918, a joint attack by Australian and Canadian soldiers achieved a stunning Allied victory near Amiens. Most experts regard it as the beginning of the end of the war. Thousands of prisoners and hundreds of guns were captured in just one day. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. Within weeks, the flow of German prisoners had turned into a flood, and German leaders were talking about an armistice. Germany's 4 great gambles, the Schlieffen Plan, Verdun, the U-boat campaign, and the 1918 March offensive had all failed. German losses could not be made good, whereas the Allied armies kept growing. The German home front was also in trouble, with food riots and talk of mutiny and political revolution. The end was near. The Allies were advancing on every front now and could not be halted. On the 30th of September, Bulgaria gave up. The Turks followed on the 30th of October. The Austro-Hungarians capitulated on the 3rd of November. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the armistice that Germany had asked for came into effect. The guns fell silent. The soldiers went home. The world was at peace again, for a time.